Good day, and welcome to Ranso's Weekly Wraps. I am Viv Govender, and this week we're going to cover Celsius listing and look at through that lens at the IPO market, both locally and internationally. Then we're going to look at the budget from the UK and what it means for economies going forward. And finally, we're going to take a deeper dive into OpenAI, or rather Google's emergence over the last, I would say, 2 weeks or so in terms of its leadership in a number of AI. So let's start off with the Celsius listing. So for those that were living under a rock, Celsius listed at the JSE this week. I mean, if you live in South Africa, you know what Celsius is. They're a telecoms company. Now, my view on the overall sector, the telecom sector, positive. I think AI is going to take off. I run an AI fund. I think AI is going to be more and more important going forward. And a lot of things AI requires is data. So, we're looking at the Google, the Meta glasses. You're looking at, self-driving vehicles from Tesla. You're looking at a whole number of different things. All those things require a lot of data. That data often has to be transported over mobile networks. And so I think the demand for data is going to be astronomical going forward. I mean, right now, the biggest demand for data in terms of like the big demand of data is actually video. So people are watching TikTok, watching YouTube, watching Netflix, etc. We're still going to be doing those things, but now we're going to add on another big demander of data. People clicking on their Meta glasses and looking at the world and I'd say analyze this. People basically having self-driving vehicles, uploading gigabytes of data every day to get updates to the like self-driving models and whatever. That's a whole new aspect of mobile, internet technology that's going to be demanded now. Bandwidth is demanded now, and so it's positive. The problem is that to do this, you need to have a big company because you need to put the infrastructure down to handle the bigger workload. I mean, if Celsius has a workload that can handle video, but doesn't have the workload that can handle the AI stuff, the AI stuff is going to be more of a penalty to it than a positive thing. And unfortunately, Celsius is too small to really take advantage of this thing. You need the big bucks, the Vodacoms, and the MTNs out there. But what this means is that also, despite the fact that it's an interesting space, I mean, I would like to be, looking at, telecoms going forward. I think it's going to be more and more in demand. So the multiples might be changing again. Unfortunately, Celsius is listing at a time in which it's probably at the end of or near the end of its growth phase. It's a point in which the big really high growth numbers have been kind of squeezed out of the company, and what's left over is kind of like a mature husk of a company that's going to go on and probably survive for a while. But it's not going to be giving you the big returns. And if you look back in the past, companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, those kind of companies, Meta, Facebook, they all listed when they were significantly cheaper than they are right now. And they listed after growing a bit, but when there was still a lot of growth left in those companies. I mean, you look at Amazon's returns over the last 20 plus years. Look at Google's returns over the last 20 plus years. We're talking multiples coming back that are huge. I mean, we're talking more than 100 times returns in some cases. That is not something that you're likely to see with a company that's listing, for instance, look at OpenAI right now, valued at $500 billion. For that to give you 100 times return, it would be worth like half of global GDP, for a $50 billion company, $50 trillion company, sorry. That's a huge, return. And it's, I think if you look at, for instance, the return on Amazon over the period of time since it's been listed, it's been, multiple hundreds of times, for OpenAI to can do that, it'd be worth more than the entire GDP of the world in any given year. Unlikely to happen. Same thing for a company like, for instance, SpaceX or a company like Anthropic. We have lots of these unlisted companies out there, Stripe and all these kind of companies that have done really massive growth and now worth hundreds of billions of dollars in some cases. And these companies have not listed yet. When they do list, they probably will still make money. They will still be giving returns to shareholders, etc. But they're not going to give the growth that they had, between $1 to $100 billion or $1 to $500 billion. Okay, that growth is now going to be captured only in the private market. I think that is a worrisome trend going forward. And as investors, there has to be a way around that. And we at Ransos will be probably debuting some stuff in the next year that's allowing investors to take advantage of that private market space and capture some of this growth that is no longer going to be available in the public markets, unfortunately. Next, moving on to the UK budget. For those that don't know what happened, Labour won the last election. They came in. They had promised not to raise taxes. They came in and they said, we looked at the books are worse than we expected. We weren't in power, we did not know this. We come into power, we took office, we looked at the books are terrible, we need to raise taxes. That was last time around. Another budget, more taxes. There's still taxes coming through by not increasing things like bans, in terms of tax bans, because if you don't increase the tax bans, by naturally people's incomes increase over time because of inflation, and therefore you get pushed up into higher tax brackets. It's a stealth tax. But they're also increasing other taxes like in the pensions and so on space. Now, what the problem the UK has, and what the problem that I think many countries are going to be having going forward, is that much of the world, and I include South Africa in here, much of Africa, much of Europe, has not recovered from 2008. 2008 was a long time ago, okay? It was 17 years ago. That's usually a long enough time to recover. But if you look at the S&P 500, the US markets, you look at India, you look at China, those places have kind of blown past that. And so if you look at the world from that point of view, thinking, hey, 2008 was a long time ago. But much of Europe, much of Africa has not recovered from that. In fact, if you go to South Africa, you go in the UK, you go to parts of the EU and so on, you will find that per capita GDP is either at or below where it was back in 2008. After 17 years, they have not seen an increase in real incomes after 17 years. That's a pretty bad thing, and especially a bad problem in Europe and partly in South Africa as well. We have these big welfare states. Government gives out these grants in South Africa, old age grants, welfare grants and so on. They do the same thing in the UK. They do the same thing in Europe. In fact, those places are much higher levels of welfare grants. Those often come along with automatic increases, especially related to inflation. And sometimes they say the inflation rate is here. If it doesn't increase, there's also maybe a 2% annual increase we put into play. Whichever is higher, 2% of inflation rate, that's what you increase by. So it's always increasing by at least the inflation rate, and sometimes increasing by more than inflation rate. And this has been going on for a long time. If we look at places like Spain, from the 1990s till now, forget about the 2000s. Effectively, we've seen no real increase in wages. Yet pensions have almost doubled in that period of time, as in real terms. And we've seen that coming through with regards to the percentage of the economies that are governed. So the UK government, for instance, under Margaret Thatcher was about 28% of GDP. Under Boris Johnson, it went up to about 34, 35%. You also had to deal with, COVID, the shutdowns and so on, to get higher. It's closer to 38% now. So it's going up and away. If anyone talks about the fact that, the UK is not taxing enough, and people are talking about a wealth tax and inequality in the UK, which has been a bit of a theme, understand that the government has never been bigger in the UK than it is right now, which means that taxes have never been higher in the UK as a percentage of GDP than they are right now. Okay? Guess what? Taxes really don't grow the economy. Big surprise here. It's a lesson that everyone should have learned long ago. But what we are seeing right now is a situation in which the amount of money being collected by taxes is not enough to basically keep up with the obligations that countries have around welfare payments and so on. And they have to obviously do something about that. Borrow more, which is difficult to do because of course it makes you vulnerable to the market, interest rates and so on. Or increase taxation, which what it does, it also decreases growth. And just another example of just how bad the UK system is. In the UK right now, 1 in 5 new cars, so 20% of all new car purchases are by people using a disability grant. Imagine that. 20% of all new car purchases are by people using a disability grant. That's a huge number. Most people in the UK basically can't afford a vehicle, but the government is obviously giving people with disability grant vehicles. And look, obviously, you do need it in certain cases, but there's also been a surprisingly high increase in people claiming disability over the last few years. It's just skyrocketed out of control. So these factors make me believe that, we are facing a very perilous situation when it comes to global financials. And I do think that if you have to look at where the governments are, what they're doing with regards to spending and borrowing and so on, being in a bit more safe haven assets, being outside the scope of just normal fiat currencies and so on, might be a smart idea in the near to long term, medium to long term, because I do think that we are probably in the midst of some kind of issue in the financial sector, that especially the public financial sector, that is going to be only resolved with a bit of a crisis. Next, we're moving on to OpenAI, or rather, like we put it another way, the rise of Google, Alphabet. So if you looked at calls like about 2 years ago when OpenAI was running high, when Microsoft was doing really well, and people are saying Sundar Pichai, the guy that runs Google, was not the right person for the job. He was more of a manager. He was like Tim Cook over at Apple. Good manager, liked by people, but not really the entrepreneur, not really the reckless kind of push things to the limit kind of person. Satya Nadella was considered to be more innovative than that, and he has been innovative. If you look at what Microsoft has done, Microsoft has a very weird chart. Rose while Bill Gates was in charge, stayed flat and slightly negative while Steve Ballmer was in charge, and then has gone like a rocket ship up since Satya Nadella took over. It's a very clear thing that he's made a huge difference to that company since his term started. But Sundar Pichai was not viewed as being as innovative, as good a CEO for these times as Satya Nadella or some other CEOs out there. But in the last couple of weeks, Google has really taken the lead. So two things they've done that have really been important. Firstly, they released Gemini 3, which by all measures is the best model in the world. Beating everyone else at benchmarks. I've used it. It does feel smarter. Now, the thing with these models at the moment is that often people who comment on them and say it doesn't feel any smarter, it's because at some point in time they get smarter than you are in your particular area. And if it's smarter than you, it's not easy to judge something that's better than you. You really can't say how much smarter something is than you. You just know it is, right? And then it comes down to the fields around Gemini versus like ChatGPT. And ChatGPT is in some ways friendlier. It has a better personality, inverted commas. And that may be what people are preferring. I mean, we saw that happen with GPT-4 versus GPT-5. GPT-5 is objectively better. The guys that made GPT-4 made GPT-5, and they say GPT-5 is better than GPT-4. People liked GPT-4 more. Why? It was friendlier. Its personality, the way it interacted with people, was felt to be nicer. So people requested GPT-4 be brought back. And in a way, some of the features of GPT-4 were translated over to GPT-5 because, like I said, people liked the feel of it. But forget about that. Gemini is objectively better than GPT-4, or GPT-5, sorry. That means Google is now the leader of the market in terms of AI. Now, this is not the first time Google's been the leader. It's been a jockeying process. One day it's ChatGPT, next day it's Gemini, next it's Claude. Claude's never been quite like the long-term leader in most things, except for certain areas like coding. Sometimes it's Grok, but usually it's the newest model takes over. This time might be different. The jump between Gemini 2 to Gemini 3 has been quite large. And the distance Gemini 3 has put ahead of, say, for instance, a ChatGPT or a Grok is quite significant. Which means that, we expect Gemini to be number one for a little while, which is a problem for OpenAI. Why? OpenAI gets money because people invest in OpenAI for the idea that they're going to create, ASI, artificial super intelligence, or AGI, artificial general intelligence, whatever you want to term it. Like the proper artificial intelligence that can do real work, replace people on the job, run robots, that kind of stuff. That's why you invest in OpenAI. You got to believe that they are going to be the leader to put really big money in it. OpenAI is talking about $1 trillion+ investment in infrastructure over the next few years. That $1 trillion+ has to come from investors, because it only makes like about $15 billion. So we're talking about thousands of billions, and it only makes like teens billions. It's like 100 times out of whack the revenue versus what they want to spend. So they need to have the kind of like the aura of being like a leader, so people invest in it. Alphabet Google doesn't need that. Alphabet Google makes $100 billion a quarter. You know what I mean? They have their own sources of finances. You don't have to believe in them for them to make the investment. In that scenario, if they fall behind, they have their own money to spend to catch up again. If they basically take a lead, the other guy doesn't have his own money to spend and therefore is unable to catch up again. That is the thing. If we see Gemini really take the market by storm and keep its number one listing for say 6 months or so, it's going to be very difficult for OpenAI to raise the funds to catch up. Okay. There's obviously other players in the market that can do this as well. The big other player is obviously Meta, Facebook. which has, for those that don't know, had a big change in terms of their leadership. A guy called Alexander Wang, it's Alexander with the E, and it's DR, not DER at the end, basically taking over. Jan LeCun, the guy that was in charge of it before the AI division, has since resigned and it's moved on. Mark Zuckerberg is very aggressive. It's very focused on trying to keep up in the AI space. Unfortunately, I just don't think he has the, he doesn't have the people or the team involved that can actually keep up. Okay, he tried to get Ilya Sutskever to join him. Ilya Sutskever is the chief scientist of OpenAI, former chief scientist of OpenAI, one of the leading minds in AI. He offered him $32 billion for his company. He got his co-founder to join, but he didn't get anyone else in the company to join. And Ilya basically didn't join. That's why I got Alexander Wang, because he bought that company, I think, for the teens of billions of dollars. Now, Google basically has DeepMind. Denis Hassabis, he's been running it from the start. Considered to be a genius in his space, and there's a nice documentary out there. If you look at it, that's highlights his accomplishments. But in addition to that, Google has a reputation that makes people want to join Google more than they want to join Meta. Meta has a very bad reputation with Facebook, with things like Cambridge Analytica and so on. So that's another possible competition to Google that's not there. So that's just the AI stuff, the actual models. Google also had another thing in the last week or so. What did they have? Meta basically comes in and says they're going to be buying Google's TPUs, transformer processing units. Why is that important? Well, the AI chip is what NVIDIA has been making, that makes NVIDIA the most valuable company in the world. Google, in addition to getting the leap on OpenAI, is now basically going up against NVIDIA and getting some really big customers. If you look at NVIDIA's sales, it's really, really chunky. About 3 customers. We don't say who they are, but we can figure out who they are. Who are the guys that can order this kind of number of chips? 3 customers are responsible for a huge chunk of their total chip sales in the AI sector. If you have a company like Meta coming across and saying, okay, we're looking at Google's TPU, that's a huge threat to NVIDIA's kind of market cap and it's called some market dominance, and therefore again an important factor to be noted here. The thing with Alphabet is that because it has that search bar that gives you that a couple hundreds of billions of dollars a year in revenue, it's allowed to go and do things like build YouTube, build Waymo, build other things. Take some time to get to number one at the TPU market, or that kind of stuff. It is something that this advantage that they have, that they have a separate kind of cash cow that makes them money, allows them to basically lose in certain cases to the competitors and still be competitive. They can lose to OpenAI until they win, and once they win, OpenAI is lost. They need to just win once or twice. OpenAI has to win all the time to maintain this level. NVIDIA has to win all the time, whereas Google only has to win once or twice to basically really disrupt NVIDIA's business. And so going forward, I think that if you're looking at AI, Google, Alphabet is probably the one essential company you need to have out there. Okay, thanks for joining me. I look forward to speaking again next week. Cheers and have a good Black Friday.